This bushfire season in Australia has been the worst in recorded history. Conservative estimates put over 1 billion Australian native animals down as victims of the flames. The Creative Relief Society decided to get together with local artists, calling on donations of pieces towards their exhibition and auction that would raise money for wildlife services. And as I hadn't had anything pre-made, I decided to make one bespoke for the theme of the auction, which was native flora and fauna. I call this piece Gumfire. This heavy bit of timber came from my grandfather's shed, who sadly we lost a few years ago, and I thought it appropriate to turn it into a project such as this. First step with any reclaimed wood, checking for hidden nails. Just running some magnets over this so I can find them and then mark them out and dock them off the end. This is my brand new Triton circular saw, which I've got some big plans for, and it worked quite well, but I decided to run it against my old little Makita. And the Diablo blade in that thing, just see the shine it gave on the wood. Much nicer cut. I think I'll have to upgrade the blade in the Triton. However, it has more power and a much bigger blade than the Makita, and I was able to do the preliminary milling with ease. Now, fortunately, I don't need this to be particularly square being an art project, so I was just able to use the edge guide on the circular saw to take off the edges and then grab the planer and remove all the old whitewash off the top. This is really my first time milling up and reclaiming wood properly, and it's just absolutely amazing to see a rough as guts piece of timber suddenly start to turn into a beautiful board. Once I planed it, I just grabbed some mineral terps and wiped it on for a moment to see what sort of colour that I was going to get. Then I had the tricky task of resawing, so my blade was going to be just too small in order to get through in 2 passes, but that's actually a good thing because it left me a tiny bit of wood in the middle of the board so it wouldn't fall apart and collapse as I did that second cut. But I did shove some supports in there just in case. So there's one little millimetre left there you can see, which I decided to wedge a chisel in and then just attack with the handsaw so it wouldn't take too long. A little bit of ugly tear out in the middle, but again, this really doesn't matter. Clean a bit off with the chisel, and the hand plane made quick work of smoothing out my 2 boards. My first successful resaw. There was a little bit of rot in one of them, which I just had to cut out with the jigsaw quickly, but it left me more than enough wood for what I was planning. For inspiration, I didn't have to go terribly far. In fact, that was about 5 metres outside the garage. On the ground I found some gum leaves. I had no idea what species they are, but they were going to be the rough guide which I would use for this design. Once I had inexpertly sketched out my gum leaf pattern, time to check out the jigsaw with some brand new shiny Diablo blades, which made my life so much easier, and started to hack away the rough shape of the eucalyptus leaves that were going to form the main component of this artwork. The trickiest bit of here was trying to make sure I left the space for joining the 2 of them together. Needed some flat edges to make my life easier down the track. And also to be cautious of the thin parts so they didn't break off. That's kind of what I was going for. Now, this isn't the safest process in the world, I'll say that straight up, but I was comfortable doing it because on the angle grinder is just an 80 grit sanding disc, so it's nothing terribly dangerous, though I had to remove the guard or I wouldn't have been able to do what I am doing here, shaping the wood. I did most of my shaping in this manner, got my PPE on. An Arbitec carver or something along those lines, of course, would be preferable, but I don't have one, and I have to make do with what I've got. I was actually surprised, even though the wood was super dense, just how well I was able to shape using this sanding disc. It did take a while, but I could see the progress, and it was jolly good fun. I purposely bumped and battered the wood in to try and give some texture and cut out some little notches and grooves here and there. Great thing about art, trying to give it an organic look comes naturally. Pulling out the Dremel, and I wanted to mark the centre vein. Gum leaves don't actually have too much to them, really. They don't have too many features that make them stand out apart from the constant damage and irregular form. So this centre line was the only carving I was going to be putting into the leaves. Did burn a little bit, but I quite like that. Made it stand out a bit more. The old sandpaper glued to a stick trick just to get the burrs off the Dremel carve, and the main form of the main piece of the artwork was done. So my joinery was going to be tricky. I'm going with dowels, but I need two flat surfaces on the two meeting points of the two leaves. So I grabbed the router and a piece of MDF, used that to create a straight edge flush trim bit, and I was able to quite nicely, with a bit of fiddling I might add, get those to look close enough that I'd be happy to whack them in some clamps with some glue. Now there's that little bit of damage just there which I had to avoid and move my dowel, which wasn't ideal, but worked in the end. Clamped on a couple of support blocks just to hold the edges in. I always get paranoid when I'm drilling with an 8mm bit into effectively about a 19mm slab there. Didn't want to blow out the sides, that would have been disastrous, but it worked quite well in the end. Only the second time I've used my little doweling jig pins here, and they worked very, very well. I could leave one in the bottom while I marked out the top, just to keep everything nice and aligned, and then drill the holes in the other side. Not gonna lie, really nervous about this. Only done it once before on the Australia path tag holder, and while that did work, I haven't even been able to use a block or a guide. I freehanded all of these to see if the dry fits together. Who needs that? To say that I'm happy that worked is a mild understatement. The joints don't need to look pretty, it doesn't even need to be super flat. I love art, you can get away with anything. Time for some glue. Except now, of course, I can't get the damn thing apart. Yep, I have never played guitar at all in my life, ever. Let's stick to gluing, shall we? Now with my dry fit done, I was happy to whack this all together. Pipe clamps to get a nice tight squeeze out. Only 2 points of contact, I need these to be very strong. Right, well that's the first component done. Now we can move on to the second. I've got my gum leaves, it's time for some gum nuts. And the board you can see me using there is a floorboard of spotted gum, which was reclaimed from a slight error made in the construction of my friend's cafe down the road, but at least I saved it from the scrap bin. So anyone who knows me knows that art is not exactly what you would call a strong suit of mine, but I did manage to freehand up the gum nuts and the flowers as well, and mark those out for some Dremel carving down the line, which we will get to in a few minutes. In the meantime, it's overnight and my glue had dried, so I could pull the gum leaves out of the clamps and make sure it looked okay. Using my guidelines, I could start to draw in the gum nut flowers. This took a while, but I managed to freehand all of them. Again, loving the organic look of this. It makes things easy when you don't get things precise. A couple of quick little plunges to get the stamens. I think that's what they're called. Sorry, chemist, not a biologist. I reckon that's all right. And then we could move on to cutting out these gum nut shapes on the inverted jigsaw table. Now it looks like I'm moving a million miles an hour here, but I was actually taking it incredibly slowly and had to use a push block a few times just to keep my fingers away from the blade. I was fairly paranoid that I was going to break some of the skinnier bits off, but this wood was quite thick. I think the floorboard was 19 or 20 mils to begin with, and I could make some little paddles. With one down, I could repeat the process for the second, and settle back into a lovely little jigsaw montage. If only it was this quick in the real world. So the stem that would join the three gum nuts was the trickiest part of this whole operation, both with cutting it out, being quite a thin piece, and then secondly, trying to figure out how I was going to join it to those gum nuts. I decided to go with some half-lap joinery, and that was going to mean getting creative because the irregular shape was going to cause me some problems. As usual, I was making stuff up completely as I went along. The solution I came up with? Router sled. It was going to allow me to do two things. Firstly, those 19mm floorboards just looked too chunky. Plus, they had glue and some runnels on the back, which I really didn't like and were going to make my life a bit of a misery. So I knocked up a quick sled, and I was able to use the router doing 2mm passes with a 19mm bit in order to thickness those down to about 13.5, 14 mils I ended up at. Of course, a thicknesser planer would have been much more useful here, but I don't have one, and I'm going to get one soon. Plus, I like jerry-rigging these sorts of solutions. The router sled worked really well, big enough just to hold a gum nut at a time, but it did make a jolly good mess. Oh look, there's my dust cart from last week. It came in handy. Pulling out all the homemade tools here, there's the disc sander angle grinder, which was burning the wood like no tomorrow because I'd worn out the sanding disc doing the carving earlier on. And the sled came into its own a second time, so I'd made it as a thicknesser, but then I quickly realised I could also use it to cut these half laps. I switched down to a 12mm bit, and I could hog out most of the material, bringing them down to about half of their thickness, but it also took quite a bit of chisel work and fussing around to get a nice fit of the stem into the 3 nuts. To be honest, I was cursing and swearing at my inability of using hand tools well, until I remembered that I have a sanding disc drum on the Dremel, and that made life much easier. I could get a pretty good tight fit at the end. This was honestly the hardest part of the whole project, and I was pretty chuffed when it finally worked out. Cheeky little 5mm round over on the bottom, just to soften those edges. And then Dremel sanding and orbital sanding, all these down to 320. I quickly attacked the stem with the angle grinder sander again because I wanted it to be slightly lower than the gum nuts at the join for when I fill it with resin. That'll become more apparent a little bit later on. Quick glue up and the gum nuts are ready to put aside until it would be resin time. While they dried, I could return my attention to the gum leaves. Bit of manual sanding to get into all the nooks and crannies, and then it was time for what I hope to be the party piece of this particular build. Some shosugi barn, the Japanese wood charring technique. Now, I'm not going the full char because firstly, I'm using a glorified Zippo lighter, being a relay torch, in order to do this. And here is some real-time footage of just how slow that is. Yeah, it's better, speed it up again. But secondly, I didn't want to damage the wood and char it up too much because I was going to have to seal it again afterwards. This took a long time, but the end result was pretty appealing. Obviously, being an artistic project based on the bushfires, I wanted to hark back to the damage that the flames can cause. So fire is a natural part of the Australian bush, but what we're seeing this year is just something else, and I wanted to reflect that in the artwork. Just a very light stain applied to the centre vein, and now it was time for the second hardest part, joining the gum nuts to the gum leaves. I returned to dowel joinery, not just for the strength, but to position them correctly so that the nuts wouldn't move around on the leaves while they were drying. This actually went pretty smoothly. The hardest part was cutting down the dowels to size to make them fit in the thinner material. In the end, the dry fit worked first time, and we were nearly there. Before I could glue them up though, we needed to do the resin on the gum nuts. Now, I didn't want this to be a bright riot of colour. It's going to be fairly subtle. I want the wood to be the star here more than the plastic resin, but I did want something to symbolise the regrowth of the bush after the fires have gone through and you see it start to spring back to life. So we had to get a bit of green in there and some red and yellow for the flowers. I'm not going to go into the resin usage too much here, being an art project. There's other resources available to you to learn more how to do that. I'm using Perfect Cast from Carbotech. I had great success with it on the Oz Geo Muster project last year, and it turned out great again here. A little bit of mica powder, a little bit of colouring, And now that I had that sled available, I didn't have to be too careful. I could pretty much load it up because I knew I'd be able to cut it back after it all set. As usual, my only enemy was time. It's recommended you leave this for a week. I risked it after 4 days. But luckily, I had a bit of leftover resin which I could pour into these jewellery moulds, and I pulled those out first, and they're a lot thicker than the resin I poured on the actual gum nuts, so stabbing them with an awl proved to me that they were set, so my gum nuts should be fine. Blue tape worked pretty well, sprung a couple of leaks here and there, and it was a bit tough to peel off the back. But fortunately, I won myself a little carbide scraper from Yellowbox Shed and Dave Stanton, and it came in very handy. I won't say I made quick work of it, but in lieu of a spiral cutter thicknesser, it got off the resin from the back well enough. Back to the router sled, and I had to very carefully set the depth here, just to take off the top millimetre or so of resin without going too deep and destroying it all together. Took a while to dial in, but once we did, the hardest part was making the damn thing fit in the sled, because I'd only made it big enough for one gum nut. So out comes the Recipro saw for a bit of hack and slash editing, and that worked a charm. Look at it fit in there nice. Back to the Dremel just to clear off some resin from the edges. Forever sanding. And there are me nuts. They look great. Final glue up went really well and gave me a chance to highlight the realities of working in a tiny shop where you can't always have the car outside. This was pretty challenging getting all those clamps on there, but we made it in the end. She's nearly done. Time to get it out of the clamps, give it a last little sand with some super fine steel wool to bring out the resin so there are no little scratches in it, and then get down to some finishing. Going to be using Danish oil and wax, and this should all darken up nicely and hopefully tie it all together. Oh, it's been nearly a month to get here. Really excited to get this project finished. Let's see how she looks. Final brush down, bit of tack cloth to get rid of all the dust, and then my favourite gym sock Danish oil trick to bring this wood back to life. Look at that beautiful grain. I've only done a couple of hardwood projects, and this is my first reclaimed hardwood project, and I was particularly happy with how it made the char blend in and make the resin pop. And there's our first look at the completed product. I had of course forgotten to put the keyhole hangers on the back again, but after it was dry it wasn't too hard to add those. And the final step of course is adding the maker's mark. I've not had to do this before, but pulled out the Dremel and signed my life away in as neat handwriting as I could muster freehand. Last little touch of finish and some Danish oil into the keyholes to protect them, and all that was left to do was a nice buff and polish with some beeswax, and it was smelling and looking great. And I've quickly learnt at why most artists are incredibly poor, because the number of hours of work that went into this, probably 30 to 40, you could never pay someone a per hourly rate. You really have to do it for the love, and there was a lot of love in this project. I absolutely adored every minute of it, from the first mill right down to the last wax polish. Got to hang it on my wall for just a little while and take some photos of what could have been. I hope you've enjoyed this commentary on the project today, as opposed to the shorter artsy version. If you have learned something or you just really liked what you saw, then please do consider subscribing to the channel. Give this thing a like. More practical workshop projects again next week. I'll catch you then. Thanks for tuning in.